She called security on him in front of 40 restaurant employees, 2 city inspectors, and a window full of people eating lunch who had no idea they were watching a $40 million partnership disappear in real time. Margot Hale had the man escorted out of her flagship kitchen like he was a health code violation. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at her once, the particular look of someone who'd already decided something, and walked out through the door with the same calm he'd walked in with. 47 minutes later, her phone rang, and the number on the screen belonged to the one person she'd been trying to reach for 6 weeks. If you're watching this from your city, drop it in the comments below. I want to know how far this story travels. Stay with me until the end. This one gets harder before it gets better. The morning started the way the important ones always did for Margot, with a list. She kept it on paper, not her phone, because her father had kept paper lists, and she'd inherited that from him along with the restaurant and the debt, and the particular kind of pride that made both things harder to manage than they needed to be. Margot Hale had taken over Hale Hospitality Group 3 years ago at 34, after her father's second heart attack. The company ran 4 restaurants in the city, a catering division, and a small events arm that had been losing money since before she'd taken the chair. What it also had was a reputation, 30 years of it, built by a man who shook every hand himself and remembered every regular's birthday, and a funding crisis that the reputation couldn't solve on its own. The Alcott deal was supposed to solve it. Brennan Alcott wasn't the kind of investor who showed up at industry conferences or gave interviews to trade publications. He'd built a food and hospitality portfolio over 15 years that quietly outperformed nearly everything else in the sector. People who'd worked with him described him in almost identical terms: low profile, high conviction, and absolutely ruthless about one thing. He only backed operators who understood what they were actually building. Not the concept, not the brand, the thing underneath both of those. He'd turned down opportunities that made other investors laugh at him for 18 months, and then made them furious when he turned out to be right. Margot had spent 4 weeks getting a meeting with his office. She'd restructured her presentation twice, redone the unit economics once, and personally walked through every lease and liability with her CFO, a careful and exacting woman named Petra, who had the gift of saying terrible things in a tone so steady it almost felt like good news. "We have approximately 8 months of runway at current burn," Petra had told her the previous Thursday, setting a single page on her desk the way a doctor set down a chart. The Alcott capital would extend that to 3 years and allow us to close the Riverside location without a public restructuring. Margot had looked at the page. She'd said nothing for a moment. "Then we get the meeting," she'd said. They got the meeting. It was scheduled for 11 o'clock at Hale's flagship, a 60-seat restaurant in the West 20s called The Larder that her father had opened before Margot was born. She'd chosen the location deliberately. She wanted Brennan Alcott to see the operation firsthand, to understand what the numbers represented in physical terms. The kitchen she'd retiled herself the summer after her father's first surgery. The staff she'd kept through 3 rounds of cost cuts because she refused to build the next version of the company on the wreckage of the people who'd built the first one. She arrived at 7:30. The prep meeting with her team ran until 9. By 10, the kitchen was running a modified service, a tasting format she'd designed to show range without looking like they were showing off. And Margot was at the host stand going over the seating chart for the 4th time when her front-of-house manager, a young woman named Tess who had excellent instincts and terrible poker face, appeared at her elbow. "There's a situation," Tess said quietly. Margot looked up. Near the pass-through to the kitchen, a man was standing with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the dining room the way someone looked at a place they were trying to understand. He was maybe 40. Medium build. He was wearing a jacket that had seen better decades and carrying a paper bag from the bodega 2 blocks over, the one that sold coffee in cups with Greek key patterns that had not changed since approximately 1987. He was not looking at his phone. He was looking at the room. "He came in off the street," Tess said. "I told him we weren't open for walk-ins, and he said he had an 11 o'clock. He's not on the list." Margot looked at the man. She felt the pull of the clock, 10:58, and the weight of everything that needed the next 2 hours to go exactly right. She'd been up since 5. She'd rehearsed the presentation in the car. She had 2 city inspectors arriving at 11:15 for a routine walk that she'd specifically requested be moved to 11:15 so it didn't overlap with Alcott's arrival window. "Handle it," she said. Tess handled it the way a 26-year-old who'd been told to handle something handled it, with total sincerity and zero hesitation. Margot watched from across the room as Tess spoke to the man, watched him respond calmly, watched Tess gesture toward the door, watched the man look over at Margot for just a moment. She was already turning away. There was a question from the kitchen about the amuse-bouche timing. There were the inspectors to think about. There was the presentation on her tablet she wanted to review one more time. She heard the side door open and close. At 11:03, a woman in a sharp gray blazer walked in carrying a leather portfolio and introduced herself as Dana Fisk, senior associate at Alcott Capital. She shook Margot's hand, looked around the dining room with the appraising eye of someone who'd walked into hundreds of spaces in a professional capacity, and said, "Mr. Alcott will be along shortly. He likes to arrive separately." Margot smiled. She said that was perfectly fine. She showed Dana to the table she'd reserved, offered coffee, and returned to the host's stand. At 11:07, she looked at the side door. At 11:09, she looked again. At 11:11, Petra appeared beside her and said, very quietly, "He's not here yet." "I know," Margot said. She went to the table. She presented. She was good at this, had been good at it since before she'd taken the company, had spent her 20s running events and catering operations that required her to be articulate and composed in rooms that didn't always want to hear what she had to say. She walked Dana through the unit economics, the lease restructure, the Riverside situation, the 3-year projection that showed what Hale hospitality looked like on the other side of the Capitol in Fusion. Dana asked 4 questions. All 4 were good. Margot answered them clearly. Brennan Alcott's chair stayed empty. At 11:53, Margot's phone buzzed on the table. She ignored it. At 11:56, Petra caught her eye from across the room with a look that Margot had learned to read as, "Something has happened and you need to stop what you're doing." She finished her sentence. She excused herself for 5 minutes. Petra was in the narrow hallway outside the kitchen holding her phone with both hands. "Read this," Petra said. The email was from Brennan Alcott's office. 3 sentences. The first said that Alcott Capital was withdrawing from all discussions regarding an investment in Hale Hospitality Group, effective immediately. The second said the decision was final. The third said they wished the company continued success. Margot read it twice. "When did this come in?" she said. 11:47. 47 minutes after the meeting had started. 47 minutes after the man in the Greek key coffee cup had been walked out the side door. She stood in the hallway. The kitchen was loud behind her, the particular noise of a professional kitchen mid-service, ordered chaos that she usually found grounding. Right now it sounded very far away. "Petra," she said. "Yeah, what does Brennan Alcott look like?" Petra was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then she took out her own phone, pulled something up, and held it out. The photograph was from a small industry publication. A man in a plain jacket, looking slightly off-camera, with the expression of someone who'd agreed to be photographed on the condition that it not take long. Margot looked at the photograph for a long time. She handed the phone back. She stood in the hallway outside her father's kitchen and said nothing for a moment that was longer than she intended. "I need to finish the meeting," she said finally. She went back in. She thanked Dana Fisk for her time. She said there would be follow-up communication from her office, which was technically true in the sense that she intended to figure out what had just happened and what, if anything, could be done about it. She shook Dana's hand, walked her to the door, and then went to the kitchen and stood at the pass-through for a few minutes and watched her team work. Her sous chef, a quiet and precise man who had been with the larder for 7 years, glanced over and read her face the way people who worked in close quarters learned to read faces. "You okay?" he said, without breaking his rhythm. "Working on it," she said. She went to her office in the back and closed the door. It was a small room, a desk, 2 chairs, a shelf of binders, a framed photograph of the restaurant the year it opened, her father standing in front of it in his chef's whites, squinting in the sun. She'd kept the photo there since she'd taken over, because she needed something in that office that reminded her what it was all for. She sat at her desk and rebuilt the morning, minute by minute, the way she sometimes rebuilt a service that had gone wrong, looking for the exact moment where the wrong decision had compounded. The man had come in off the street. He'd been holding a bodega coffee. He'd said he had an 11 o'clock. Tess had told him he wasn't on the list. He'd looked over at Margot. She'd turned away. There was a version of the morning where she'd done something different, where she'd walked over instead of away, where she'd said hold on and asked his name, where something in the quality of how he stood, the particular absence of anxiety in a man who'd been told he was in the wrong place, had registered as information rather than noise. She hadn't done that version. She started researching the next morning. What she found on Brennan Alcott was both sparse and clarifying. He'd started his fund 14 years ago with a small group of investors and built it into one of the most consistent performers in food and hospitality venture. He was 41. He did not do press. In the one profile piece she found, from a regional business magazine, the kind that ran profiles of people who didn't seek them out, a source had described his investment philosophy in a single sentence. He backed people, not decks. The deck told him what you wanted him to know. How you behaved in a room told him what you were actually like. She put the article down. She looked at the photograph of her father on the shelf. She called Dana Fisk that afternoon. The call went to voicemail. She left a message, composed, no desperation in her voice, saying she'd appreciate the opportunity to understand what had influenced the decision if Dana was willing to speak. Dana called back 20 minutes later. Mrs. Hale, she said. That was her opening. Just the name, with nothing attached to it. Thank you for calling back, Margot said. I almost didn't. A pause. What happened yesterday was preventable, Dana said. Her voice wasn't unkind. It was the voice of someone who had made a decision to be direct rather than diplomatic because she'd decided directness was more useful. You had a meeting with someone who was prepared to seriously consider a significant investment in your company. He walked in without an announcement because that's how he does first meetings. He wants to see how an operation behaves when it doesn't know it's being evaluated. And he was asked to leave. I know, Margot said. Do you know why that mattered specifically? Margot thought about it honestly. Because how we treated him tells him something about how we treat people we don't recognize as important. Danica was quiet for a moment. He was watching to see what you would do, she said. Not your staff, you. When Tess asked him to leave, he looked at you. He told me that, and you were already somewhere else. Margot held the phone and looked at the office wall. Is there anything I can do, she said. Probably not, Dana said. He doesn't revisit closed decisions as a rule. A pause. But he did ask me one question this morning. Margot waited. He asked whether you made the call yourself or had someone else do it. Margot looked at her phone screen, her name, her number. I called, she said. I know, Dana said. I told him. 3 days later, Petra came to Margot's office at 5 in the afternoon and closed the door. Petra only closed the door when the information she was carrying shouldn't travel through glass. I've been going through the Callaway Group term sheet, she said. The Callaway Group had reached out the morning after Alcott Capital withdrew. The timing had struck Margot as unfortunate. She was beginning to reconsider that word. And, she said, Petra set a single page on the desk. Her handwriting was small and exact, the handwriting of someone who'd trained herself to be precise because imprecision had cost her something once. The Callaway Group's primary capital source traces through 2 holding entities to a private equity vehicle called Century Vantage Partners. Century Vantage was incorporated 22 months ago. She paused. Its registered agent is a law firm that also represents one of our board members, Jeffrey Marsh. Margaret looked at the page. Jeffrey Marsh had been on the Hale Hospitality Board for 5 years, appointed in the year after her father's first surgery, when the company had brought in outside governance to reassure creditors. He was 63, had a background in commercial real estate and hospitality finance, and had been in Margot's experience enthusiastically supportive of every significant decision she'd made since taking the chair. Everyone. She'd trusted that. How certain are you? She said. I spent 11 hours on this, Petra said. I'm certain. The room went very quiet. Outside the office, the kitchen was winding down from dinner prep. She could hear the particular sounds of a kitchen at end of shift, the scrape of equipment, the drop in voices, the building settling back into itself. Don't tell anyone, Margot said. Already haven't. I need to think, she said. She thought all night. By 7 in the morning, she was at the counter of the bakery around the corner from her apartment. A small place that smelled like cardamom and burnt sugar and had been there for 23 years, run by a woman named Bet, who always had the same question. Margot was on her second coffee and a legal pad full of handwriting when the bell above the door rang. She knew before she looked. Some part of her brain had been assembling the picture of this person for days, and it recognized the signal, the way the room shifted slightly, the same recalibration she'd felt in her own dining room a week ago. Brennan Alcott walked in. He was with a kid, a boy who looked maybe 9 or 10, wearing a jacket with a hood and carrying improbably a pair of binoculars around his neck. The kid went straight to the pastry case and pressed his face close to the glass with the focused intensity of someone conducting important research. Brennan said something low to the boy and then looked up. He saw Margot. He didn't leave. He ordered at the counter, said something to the boy, who had by this point identified his target and was waiting with the patience of a child who has decided what he wants and intends to have it, and then crossed to the small table 2 away from where Margot was sitting. She sat with it for 90 seconds. Then she got up. She walked to his table. She stood there until he looked up, which took about 3 seconds. I owe you an apology, she said. She hadn't scripted it. Not the professional kind, a real one. What happened in my restaurant was wrong. And it was wrong because I wasn't paying attention to the right things. I was looking at the clock and the inspectors and the presentation, and I wasn't looking at who was standing in the room. Brennan looked at her. His expression was the same one she recognized from 7 days ago, quiet, attentive, not hostile, not warm. You didn't make it easy, she said. You could have. You chose not to, and I still got it wrong. I'm sorry. Something moved in his face, not much, but something. Sit down, he said. She sat. The boy appeared at Brennan's elbow, carrying a croissant on a small plate, and looked at Margot with frank curiosity. He had Brennan's coloring and a smear of powdered sugar on his left sleeve. This is my son, Theo, Brennan said. He said the name the way people said the names of things that mattered to them. Not performing it, just stating it. Hi, Theo, Margot said. Theo looked at the binoculars around his neck, then back at Margot. Do you know what kind of birds are in this neighborhood? He said. House sparrows, she said. Some starlings. I've seen a peregrine on the water tower on 11th. Theo's eyes went wide. He looked at Brennan. Brennan looked at Margot with an expression that she was fairly certain was the closest thing to surprise she'd yet seen from him. Been looking for one for 3 weeks, Brennan said. The water tower, Theo said urgently. Which one on 11th? She told him. He wrote it in a small notebook he produced from his jacket pocket with the efficiency of someone who had a system. Brennan watched this, and something in the set of his face shifted. Not quite a smile, but in the direction of one. I know what my company needs, Margot said. And I'm not here to pitch you. She paused. But I think something is wrong inside my company. Something more significant than a bad meeting. And I'm trying to understand the shape of it before I move. He looked at her. Why are you telling me this? Because you already walked away, she said. You have no stake in what I do with it. If you tell me what you know, you're telling me for an honest reason. Brennan wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He looked at Theo, who was now studying a photograph on the bakery wall with his binoculars from a distance of approximately 18 inches. Jeffrey Marsh, he said. The name landed in the space between them. He contacted us 6 weeks before your meeting, Brennan said, through an intermediary. He represented that any capital arrangement with Hale Hospitality would include a preferred advisory role for a consulting entity he was connected to. He told us this was consistent with how you structured major partnerships. He paused. When I came to your restaurant, I wasn't only evaluating the pitch. Margot held very still. And then I was shown the side door, he said. Not with satisfaction. Just fact. I understand, she said. I don't think you understand all of it yet. He leaned forward slightly. It was the first time he'd changed his posture. What Marsh communicated to us, if it's accurate, means the meeting was never designed to close on the terms you presented. He was positioning to renegotiate the structure after the fact in a way that served his interests and not your company's. Margot looked at the table, then at him. Can you prove it? I can tell you what I know, he said. What you do with it is yours to decide. I mean that literally. This has to be your move, not mine. She understood where the line was. She understood that he was drawing it clearly and that it was fair. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. Theo came back to the table, carrying a second croissant he had apparently acquired through means that were unclear. He sat down and looked between the two of them with the calm assessment of a child who read rooms the way he read field guides. Are you going to be friends? He said. Theo, Brennan said. I'm just asking, Theo said. Margot looked at this kid with his binoculars and his notebook and his powdered sugar sleeve. I think we're working on it, she said. Theo considered this. Okay, he said, and took a bite of croissant. Brennan looked at her over his son's head. The corner of his mouth moved. She stood, she picked up her legal pad. I have a lot of work to do, she said. I know, he said. She walked out into the morning, which was cold and sharp, and she started walking. She walked 10 blocks before she slowed down. Her brain worked better in motion. Had since she was a kid, since she used to walk the farmer's market with her father on Saturday mornings, while he pointed at produce and explained why one peach was worth more than another, and she'd pretended to care about peaches, but was actually learning how he thought. By the time she turned back toward the restaurant, she had a list. What she had: Petra's documentation of the Callaway-Sentry Marsh connection, Brennan's account of the intermediary approach, the timeline, Jeffrey pushing hard for the Alcott meeting, Jeffrey's enthusiasm for every deal she'd brought in the past 3 years, Jeffrey being the first person to call after Alcott withdrew and suggest, warmly and helpfully, that Callaway might be a better fit. What she needed: a connection that survived a board vote, something documented, something a lawyer couldn't take apart in 20 minutes. What she didn't have: time to be wrong. She called her corporate attorney that morning. His name was Leonard Chu, no relation to anyone she knew, and he'd been handling governance work for the company for 4 years. He picked up on the second ring, listened to 3 minutes of context without interrupting, and said, "Don't move anything. Don't confront him. Get me everything you have by end of week." She got him everything by Thursday morning. Petra worked 2 late nights to compile it. What emerged across 63 pages was not one thing but several things layered on top of each other. An advisory contract from 18 months ago paid at a rate 30% above market to a consulting firm that Margot had never directly vetted because Jeffrey had handled the engagement. A vendor relationship in the catering division that on closer examination ran through an entity with quiet connections to the same financial network. And a potential partnership from 2 years prior, a regional food hall that would have been transformative for the company that had died at the board level on Jeffrey's recommendation that the timing wasn't right. And that had been acquired 8 months later by an operator with observable ties to Jeffrey's investment circle. Not one bad decision, a pattern. She sat with the 63 pages and felt something that wasn't quite anger. Anger was too fast and too hot for this. What she felt was slower and colder. The feeling of a decision solidifying. The feeling of knowing exactly what you were going to do and accepting the cost of it before you began. Leonard arrived at her office Friday morning with the manner of someone who'd read the documents that night and had come in early to think about them without distraction. "What we have is significant," he said. "What we need is either a direct paper trail on the Alcott intermediary approach or additional documentation linking Marsh to the financial benefits across the timeline. The pattern you've built is strong. A corroborating source outside the company makes it substantially stronger." Margot thought about the bakery, about Brennan's hands around his coffee cup, about the line he'd drawn. "I'll reach out to him," she said. "No promises. If he's willing to document what the intermediary communicated, even informally, it changes the weight of what we're bringing to the board." After Leonard left, Margot sat at her desk for 10 minutes. She thought about what she needed to say and what she didn't. She thought about Theo writing in his notebook with the particular seriousness of a kid who understood that paying attention was a way of respecting something. She found the number Dana Fisk had called from. She sent a text. She kept it to 2 sentences. She said she wasn't asking for anything related to the investment. She said she'd explain when they spoke. The reply came back in 4 minutes. Tomorrow. The bakery. 7:30. She exhaled. She spent the weekend preparing. Not obsessively. She'd learned at some cost that over-preparing for a hard thing was its own kind of avoidance. She knew what she had. She knew what the board meeting needed to look like. She knew what Jeffrey would do when she started laying it out. He would interrupt, he would reframe, he would use the warmth he'd spent 5 years building in that room and point it at the other board members like something that had never been a weapon. He would be very good at this. She needed to be better. She ran through every version of his response until she'd mapped them all. She went to bed at 10 and slept better than she had in 2 weeks. Saturday morning at the bakery, Brennan came in at 7:30 exactly. Alone this time, Theo presumably at a weekend game or class. He ordered at the counter and sat across from her and looked at the documents she'd set on the table and then looked at her face. "How bad is it?" he said. "Bad enough," she said. "But I can prove it." She paused. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to know I've built the case without your answer. I'm not asking you to carry this." He nodded. "The intermediary who approached your office," she said. "Is there anything you can give me in writing? Not testimony, not a formal declaration. Just what you observed documented." Brennan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the window. The morning was gray and close, the kind of Saturday that felt undecided about what it wanted to do. "Who's your lawyer?" he said. She told him. Something in his expression shifted, recognition, and something that might have been a quiet form of respect. "I know Leonard," he said. "He's thorough." "I know." He was quiet again. She waited. She'd been getting better at waiting. It had cost her something to learn that. She used to fill silence like it was a problem to solve. "The intermediary's name is Conrad Vell," he said. "He represents himself as a deal facilitator. I've seen his name in 2 other situations where a board-level insider used him to position a transaction to their own benefit. I can give you a written account of the approach, the date, the specific terms that were communicated." He paused. "I'll have Dana send it to Leonard by end of day." She held his gaze. "Thank you. One condition," he said. She waited. "You walk into that board meeting yourself, not Leonard, not your CFO. You put it on the table, and you stand there while they look at it." She almost said, "Of course." Then she stopped. Because he knew it wasn't of course, and she knew it wasn't of course, and saying it that way would have been the easy version of what he was asking. "I know," she said. "I know it has to be me." He nodded. He picked up his coffee. They sat for a while. Bet came by and refilled the cups without being asked, which was one of the better things about the place. The conversation moved. He mentioned a property he'd been evaluating in a different market. She told him about a supplier relationship she was rebuilding in the catering division. Neither of them mentioned the board meeting directly after that. It was there in the room, the way large things were sometimes in rooms, and they talked around it and through it, and both of them knew what the next week would cost. She left at 8:50. He walked to the door with her. They stood on the sidewalk in the gray morning. "Don't let him leave that room with anything," he said. She held that for a second. Then she nodded. She walked to the corner and turned, and the bakery was behind her, and she was in the city again. The emergency board meeting was Monday at 10. She'd submitted the formal request Sunday evening. 5 confirmations by 9 p.m. Jeffries came in at 10:40, which told her he'd spent the intervening time deciding whether to appear. He'd decided to appear. Absence told its own story, and he was too careful for that. Margot took the elevator to the board floor alone. She'd claimed the head of the table before the room filled. Leonard sat to her left, Petra across from him. The 4 other board members filed in over the next 8 minutes, and Jeffrey arrived at 10:02, wearing the same warm ease he wore to every meeting, shaking hands, making brief contact with each person, the professional warmth moving through the space ahead of him like weather. He sat down. He looked at Margot at the head of the table, and something crossed his face for just a moment, a recalibration, and then the smile came back. "Margot," he said, "unusual format for a Monday." "Thank you for making the time, Jeffrey," she said. She began. She followed the sequence Leonard had outlined, timeline first, pattern before the name. She walked the board through the advisory contracts, the vendor relationships, the food hall acquisition from 2 years prior. She laid it out factually, without adjectives, and let the dates speak. She watched the faces around the table, one board member leaning forward, another going still, the third making a note with a pen she couldn't hear moving until that moment. She did not look at Jeffrey. She presented the Callaway connection, the Century Vantage Trail, the registration, the law firm. She heard Jeffrey shift in his chair. "I'd like to address some of this," he said. His voice was smooth. "I think there's important context that." "Under the emergency disclosure provision," Margot said without raising her voice, "the CEO's integrity disclosure may not be interrupted until complete. I'd ask you to hold your response until I'm finished." She looked at him, held his gaze for exactly as long as it took to establish that she wasn't looking away. Then she looked back at her documents. She presented Conrad Vell's account last, the written statement from an external party. She didn't say Brennan's name. The document was attributed to a principal at an outside investment firm, which was accurate and sufficient. She read 3 passages. The intermediary's name, the terms that had been communicated, the date and the specific advisory arrangement that had been described as board authorized, that had appeared in none of the deal documentation Margot had prepared or approved. She set the document down. She looked at the room. The board members were looking at Jeffrey. One of them, a woman named Claudia, who had been on the board since before Jeffrey, who had known Margot's father and had the manner of someone who had run out of patience for certain kinds of waste, was looking at him with an expression that had nothing warm in it at all. Jeffrey looked at Margot. This was the moment Leonard had described, the forward lean, the expression calibrating toward wounded reasonableness. The look that said, "I am being misrepresented by someone who is under stress and not thinking clearly." It was a good look. She could see exactly why it had worked before. She looked back at him and did not look away. "These are serious allegations," he said, "and I want to be clear that I take them seriously. But what we're looking at is a set of circumstantial connections and one external account from an unnamed party, presented by a CEO who is understandably under significant pressure after the loss of a major deal." He looked at the table. "I think what this company needs right now is perspective, not a crisis we've manufactured, Claudia," Margot said, addressing the board member directly. "Would you read the fiduciary duty provision from Section 8 of our governing documents?" Claudia read it. 12 words with very little room for interpretation. "A documented pattern of conduct across 26 months," Margot said, "with evidence of financial benefit routed to connected outside parties, satisfies the burden for an emergency governance review." She looked at the full table. "I'm not asking this board to reach a verdict. I'm asking you to authorize an independent audit of every transaction, advisory engagement, and deal recommendation involving the board chair over the past 4 years, and to require his recusal from all board activity pending the outcome." Silence. The kind that had weight. Jeffrey put both hands on the table. "I've given 5 years to this company," he said. 5 years, and I think this board knows. I think we've heard the disclosure." The voice was Claudia's. She was looking at Jeffrey the way you looked at someone you'd misjudged. "Let's vote." Something shifted in Jeffrey's face, the structure of the warmth, the way a held thing begins very slightly to let go. The vote took 3 minutes. The motion to authorize an independent audit passed 4-1. The motion for recusal pending audit passed 4-1. The one vote against both was Jeffrey's own. He voted looking straight ahead. When it was done, he stood, straightened his jacket, and looked at Margot. "You're making a mistake," he said, not with warmth, the voice under the voice which she hadn't heard before. "I don't think I am," she said. He left. The door closed. The room reconfigured itself around his absence. Shoulders dropped. Someone exhaled audibly. Claudia looked at Margot across the table and gave her one slow nod, the kind that carried more than words would. Margot nodded back. She stood until the room emptied, and then she sat down, because her legs were doing something she didn't want anyone to see. She put both palms flat on the table and breathed. Leonard sat back down across from her. "You held the room," he said. "I held the room," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. After Leonard left, Petra stayed. She sat across from Margot with the expression she wore after very long things were finished, a little wrung out, a little relieved. "It's going to go public," Petra said. "I know. We get ahead of it. Employees first." Petra nodded. "Your father would have handled it exactly this way," she said. Not casually, not as a comfort, as a fact she'd been sitting with. Margot looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." She sent a text to Brennan from the boardroom. 4 words. The vote went through. His reply came back in 6 minutes. 3 words. "I know you did." She looked at it. She didn't know what path of information had traveled that quickly. She didn't think it was a path. She thought it was something else. The particular confidence of a person who had assessed someone carefully and wasn't surprised by the result. The story went public on Wednesday. By then, the employee message had already gone out. Margot had written it herself, in plain language, at her kitchen table Tuesday night, because the people who worked in those 4 restaurants had given her things she couldn't repay by sending them a communication that sounded like a press release. She told them the truth. She told them the company was stable. She told them she wasn't going anywhere. She got 41 replies by end of business. The thing she hadn't expected was what was in them. Not reassurance-seeking, more like relief. Like people who'd been sensing something off in the structure of things for longer than they'd had words for, and had finally been told, "Yes, you weren't wrong," and someone saw it. She kept those. The audit took 8 weeks. The firm that conducted it was thorough and dispassionate. The lead auditor was a woman who dealt in facts the way surgeons dealt in anatomy, and who told Margot at the outset, "We may find things you didn't expect." "Find them anyway," Margot said. They found them. The full scope was wider than 63 pages. Jeffrey had been operating this way for longer than 2 years. The food hall acquisition was one of 3 instances where a deal had been killed at board level and then taken up by a connected party. The total financial benefit traced to his network across 4 years was a number that made Margot very still when she read it. She sat with the auditor's report in her office for a long time. She looked at the photograph of her father on the shelf. He had trusted this man. She had trusted this man. And the trust had been, from the beginning, a tool. She'd never know how much of what she'd built in 3 years had been built, despite what Jeffrey was doing, and how much of it would have been larger, faster, more possible if he hadn't been doing it. She decided to sit with that rather than resolve it too quickly. Some things needed to stay failures for a while before they could become corrections. The referral to the relevant authorities was submitted the following Friday. It was public by the afternoon. Margot did one statement. She said what needed to be said and nothing that didn't. Jeffrey's attorney issued a denial in the language attorneys used for denials. She read it once and set it aside. The rebuilding was slower than the crisis and more interesting. She reconstituted the board properly. Took 2 months to find the right people. She vetted them herself, with Claudia's input, and was specific about what she was looking for. Not people who'd be easy, people who'd be right. She rewrote the conflict of interest process. She rebuilt the vendor review protocols. She implemented access controls on the financial systems that should have been there from the start. And she held herself accountable for not asking the questions that would have surfaced them earlier. That was the harder work, not the governance reforms. The internal reckoning with the fact that she'd been running this company for 3 years and the thing Jeffrey had built had survived. Not because she was careless, but because she'd been looking outward, at the market, at the competition, at the funding gap, and not inward, at the room she was already in. It was the same thing that had happened the morning Brennan walked into her restaurant. She'd been looking at the clock, at the inspectors, at the presentation, and not at the person standing 10 feet away. She added it to the list of things she was working on. The proposal was ready in the second week of March. She'd spent 6 weeks on it, not rushing. She'd made herself build it at the pace the quality required, because the urgency of October had been a symptom of a crisis, and this wasn't a crisis. This was a deliberate choice. She called Dana Fisk on a Tuesday morning. Said she had a proposal and would like to present it at Alcott Capital's convenience. He's asked about your timeline twice in the last month, Dana said. They scheduled for Thursday. Margot arrived at Alcott Capital's offices expecting something designed to impress. What she found was a floor in a mid-rise building with good light and furniture that wasn't trying to announce anything. It was the office of a person who didn't need the room to speak for them because they'd decided to speak for themselves. Brennan was at his desk when Dana showed her in. He stood. They shook hands, which was slightly formal, given that they'd now spent several Saturday mornings in a bakery, and they both registered this at the same time, and the handshake dissolved into something that was close to a laugh. "Sit down," he said. She sat. She put the proposal on the table. 37 pages. Every page earned. "I want to walk through it with you," she said. "Not President, I want you to ask me things as we go." He looked at her. "Okay," he said. They went through it for 80 minutes. His questions were the kind that came from someone who'd actually read what was in front of them, pushing on the real uncertainties, not the comfortable ones. Twice she said, "I don't know yet, but here's how I'm planning to find out," which she wouldn't have been able to say 4 months ago, when pride had been more expensive to carry than it was now. When they reached the transparency provision, a section she'd written herself, laying out mutual disclosure standards that went further than most investors expected, he stopped. He read it twice. "This is unusual," he said. "I'm offering a different company than I had in October," she said. "The terms should reflect that." He set the document down. He looked at her directly. "Subject to 2 changes, minor structural, Dana will send the notes today, and a follow-up conversation with your CFO on the year 2 projections. I'm in." Margot held that for a moment. "We're going to build something worth building," he said. Not as encouragement, as assessment. "I know we are," she said. They shook hands again. It meant something different than the first one. She took the elevator down and stepped out onto the street and stood on the sidewalk in the March cold. The city was doing what it always did, moving, indifferent in the good way, the way of something large enough not to need your attention. She thought about a morning in October. A man in an old jacket with a bodega coffee cup, standing in her dining room with his hands in his pockets, looking at the room the way you looked at something you were trying to understand. She'd turned away. She thought she was looking at the right things. She hadn't been. She started walking. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, which turned out not to be unknown. Theo had apparently acquired her contact information through channels she chose not to examine. "Dad said you did the thing. Congrats. Do you want to look for the Peregrine Saturday?" Margot stopped on the sidewalk. She looked at the message. She looked at the city. She typed back, "Yes, bring the binoculars." A pause. Then, obviously, she put her phone in her pocket and kept walking. The work ahead was long and not always glamorous, and would include rooms she hadn't anticipated yet, and mistakes she hadn't made yet, and the daily unglamorous business of running something worth running. But the company was standing. The people in it still had their jobs. The thing her father had built across 30 years had not been allowed to be taken apart quietly from the inside. She'd done that. Not alone, she'd had Leonard, Petra, Claudia, Brennan at the right distance. But she'd done it. She'd built the case herself, walked into the room herself, held the room herself. And she'd learned the lesson that would probably take the rest of her career to fully understand, that the hardest part of being responsible for something was not the crisis. The crisis at least told you where to stand and what to do. The hardest part was the long work of building something that deserved the protecting, of becoming, slowly and through the ordinary accumulation of better decisions, the person who could be trusted with it. She turned the corner. The street opened up ahead of her, the market awnings, the delivery trucks, the particular mid-morning life of a city that didn't stop for anyone's hard season. Saturday she would bring binoculars of her own.